Hi, JEDRAS from Corsi here. In this video, I'd like to talk about how to get started with sharpening. It's not as difficult as it might seem to some of you. I want to talk a little about how to sharpen, what to sharpen with, and what's important in that process. Most knives are very thin at the bottom and a bit wider at the top of the blade, so they have a wedge shape. But when you're putting a bevel on a blade, you never get to full thinness here. The bevel doesn't taper to nothing. Those are very rare cases, and usually you get some thickness here. The thinner this dimension is, the sharper the knife will feel to you and the easier it will be to sharpen it because there's less material to remove to regain that acute edge. So when you're buying knives, pay attention to that thickness here. It is a very important characteristic of a knife. Regardless of the thickness, our goal in sharpening will be to symmetrically remove material from both sides until those tiny bevels meet and form an acute edge. So we'll gradually sand material from the right and from the left, back and forth, until at some point they come together here. When they finally meet, and if you won't stop there, you might encounter what is known as a burr, which is essentially a thin steel flake that forms at the edge of the blade and is so fine that it no longer maintains its shape and begins to bend outwards. This is what it looks like. If we have a sharpening stone here, this is the knife we're sharpening, then here we might get such a burr forming. It can extend a few centimeters along the blade, and sometimes you can feel it by running your finger across the blade like this. That thing is sticking out from it. And this burr is actually a very handy phenomenon. It tells us that we truly have a sharp knife. Now we just need to get rid of this burr. So basically, sharpening a knife comes down to removing material at the right angle from both sides until a burr forms, and then you'll finish it all off. Now, where do we know which angle to use? The answer to that question, as usually, is it depends. But for the vast majority of knives and applications, angles around 15 to 18 degrees per side are sufficient. So if we have our knife here with the cutting edge, from the axis of the knife we move at 15 to 18 degrees to each side, which means at the bottom we will get approximately 30 to a little over 30 degrees. For the majority of tool steels that are used, and for most applications, this will give you really decent conditions, and at the same time the edge won't be fragile. The smaller the angle, the more delicate the cutting edge will be. In a moment, we'll get into the technical aspects of how to set the knife, how to guide it along the sharpening stone, but first I'd like to draw your attention to something else. What should we use to sharpen? There is a whole array of different devices on the market that are supposed to magically make sharpening easy and foolproof, but from my experience, most of them actually end up forcing you to do it wrong. And the solutions that actually work are basic and simply as surface sharpeners. Bench stones, water stones for instance, this one here, which is a slab made of synthetic abrasive material or plates with diamond coating. These are really the two best, most universal solutions, which allow you to fully control the blade during sharpening. The important thing in sharpening is not to change the shape of the cutting edge, especially regarding kitchen knives. If the knife manufacturer has determined that the curvature of the edge should look this way, it most probably makes some sense. This means that if it has this shape, the knife will be easy to use. Now, if I would sharpen this knife in a clumsy way and I would unevenly remove material from different parts of this edge, I would actually be wearing down the knife, changing the curvature of the edge, and that's something we want to avoid. So when it comes to sharpening knives, we need to use sharpeners that have a surface like those made of diamond or whetstones, while we should rather avoid sharpeners like this, honing rods, ceramic sticks, or pull-through sharpeners, which can be harmful in many respects. If we have a knife and we want to evenly remove material from the entire length of its cutting edge using a honing rod, we'd need to perfectly align the knife to the rod at the contact point. When you start moving the blade along the rod, that very point of contact will never actually remove any material because as soon as you begin the motion, that point is off the rod already. So using rods and pull-through sharpeners over time leads to material being drawn out from the middle of the blade. In essence, it ends up as something like this. And we remove material from here to there, leaving the heel and leaving the tip, which makes the edge flatten out and then concave. You might recognize such knives in your grandma's drawer, which were once chef's knives, but then due to this material being taken away from here, they developed a sort of heel and now look very much like boning knives. This is precisely because the material from this part wasn't collected, and if you do have such a forged thick bolster there, then it's a game over. You need to get rid of that because it will always limit this area and you won't be able to properly sharpen it. So when the knife has the material worn away from the middle, it loses contact with the cutting board. If we're chopping on a board, it means that the whole cutting edge is actually hanging in the air and doesn't slice through what is between the knife and the board, so we try to avoid that. Our goal in sharpening knives will be to evenly remove material from both sides until we achieve a acute edge here. And we try to gather the material evenly along the entire length of the cutting edge. As I mentioned earlier, we should use surface sharpeners for sharpening, and in reality we have two options on the market: either water stones, of which there is a whole variety, or diamond dust sharpeners. Each option has its pros and cons, and in the case of water stones, a good thing is that as the stone wears down the knife also wears down the stone. Consequently, the stone will wear down gradually and maintain the same grit level. So if it's 3000 grit today, by the time it wears down and breaks, it will still be 3000 grit. However, the quite intuitive downside of water stones is that they need to be used wet. That brings some additional mess to the situation. First you gotta soak the stone and then splash around in the sludge while you're sharpening, and afterwards clean it all up. Because the knife also wears down the stone will lose its flatness, often being worn down more in the middle, so the stones need to be flattened periodically. So before we even start, we should firstly soak the stone and flatten it. Sharpening with water stones can be a bit of a hassle, but if you do it often or have Japanese knives which require a slightly different technique, then investing in water stones is definitely a good choice. However, diamond-coated plates are probably the least bothersome option in practice when it comes to abrasive materials. With diamond plates, you sharpen fast, you can sharpen dry, go forwards and backwards, and really you can't do them any harm. However, one potential downside could be that it's a surface coating, so over time with repeated abrasion against the coating, it'll gradually wear away. So this diamond plate that used to be 400 is probably 600 by now, and in time it'll be around 800, which definitely matters if you're doing a lot of sharpening, but for home use conditions, these diamond-plated sharpeners actually last quite long, so I'm a big fan of diamond sharpeners. This is based on my observation that most people don't generally sharpen their knives poorly, they just don't sharpen them at all. If you dread the thought of having to prepare a lot of stuff to sit down somewhere in that muck, then with such a diamond-coated sharpener, you just pull it out of the drawer, swipe the knife 3 times right and left, and you have a sharp knife. I believe this ease of use could actually encourage you to return to sharpening more often. Sharpening is very important, there's no escaping from it. So let me show you how to work with a diamond-coated sharpener and how to slide the knife across it. This will be our demonstration knife, and I'd like to point something out. This knife has never been sharpened before, so it still has this tiny surface here along the edge. And we can also notice this surface by looking at this edge from above so that the light reflects off of it and catches our eye, which means we don't look at the knife frontally or from the back. We look at it in such a way that we have the cutting edge facing us. Rotate the knife until you notice the gleam. If your knives are extremely dull, you'll see a shiny line reflecting the light, sometimes just on part of the blade, other times along the entire edge. It's crucial to recognize this because it's the simplest way to check if your blade is in a relatively good condition. If you notice the edge shimmering, it means the knife is completely blunt and needs sharpening, and you don't need to touch it at all to know that. So like this one here is completely blunt. Of course, don't check it with your finger like this. Instead, we can take a piece of paper. It will just glide over the paper, not cutting anything. Once we know that our knife is dull and we want to sharpen it, we simply place the stone flat in front of us. Make sure it doesn't slide, it should have clean feet. You can also stick it to the countertop with double-sided tape to make sure it's stable. Also try to look for a possibly heavy bench stone. If you purchased a knife from us or are planning to, you either have or will have these little triangles. They have an 18-degree angle. You can also try to make such a triangle yourself at home by printing it out on a piece of cardstock. This triangle will allow us to position the knife properly in relation to the sharpener. We just place it under the blade. We rest the blade on it and know that it's roughly 18 degrees. It really doesn't matter that much whether it's 18 degrees or 17.5 or 15. When we have a knife with a well-made grind and a thin cutting edge, then the sharpening angle is secondary. In reality, knives with thin edges cut even when they are dull, so whatever clumsy work we do on that edge will fortunately be good enough anyway. So don't worry too much about it. The important thing is to maintain the angle consistently, but whether it's exactly 18 degrees or not doesn't really matter. The movement that will actually remove material from the blade will be a forward and backward motion. But if we were to go just there and back like this, we risk removing material unevenly, potentially creating a notch in the edge. So when sharpening, we combine a forward and backward motion with a sideways shift of the blade. We try to pass over the entire sharpener there and back, so every bit of the cutting edge makes contact with the sharpener with each pass. I usually start with the heel of the blade somewhere around this area on my side of the sharpener. The hand holding the knife is responsible for maintaining the angle. The other hand primarily helps to make the motion smooth and applies pressure to the different areas of the blade. You see, I start with the pressure on this finger. The pressure should always be within reach of the sharpener, so the pressure moves from this spot, then this finger takes over, then this one, then this one. When the part, for which a particular finger is responsible, appears on the sharpener, we shift the pressure there, and this finger then just keeps the angle. The thing we really want to avoid is running the blade along the sharpener's edge, or going back and forth like this. We want to use the sharpener's surface, not the edges, since its edges will act the same way a honing rod does, so we try to lead the knife flat so that it doesn't wobble to sides. Then you just go back and forth. At first, don't rush, don't press too hard. Especially with diamonds, it doesn't make sense to press too hard because they remove material quickly and effectively. Try to get the hang of this motion. Once you're comfortable with it, you can start to speed up. For me, the hand guiding the knife always leads and sort of pulls the knife forward, and then the other hand catches up. When we switch sides, we keep holding the knife in the leading hand. We don't change to the left unless you're ambidextrous. However, the fingers that were previously pointing at the blade and the thumb on the spine now swap places. So the thumb will hold the blade, the index finger the spine, and now this hand maintains the angle, while I distribute the rest here. I begin again with the heel of the blade on this side from the other side of the sharpening stone, and the hand holding the knife pulls the knife toward me, meaning it's in the front, while the other hand completes the motion. So we keep on rocking back and forth. With symmetrical grinds, and the vast majority of kitchen knives have symmetrical grinds, we aim to make 5 to 10 passes on each side, and then we check what's happening. So let's get to it. As you get more comfortable, feel free to speed up. You can also split the motion and, for example, sharpen the straight part of the edge and the curved part separately. To sharpen the curvy part near the tip, you pull the handle upwards, raising the elbow to press the tip of the blade against the sharpener. At the end, it's worth making a few strokes that cover the entire length of the edge. When we'll be approaching the finishing passes, we'll discuss shortly how we'll get to know that the edge is getting acute. As we approach the end of the sharpening process, we can start changing sides more frequently, for instance every 3 strokes, then every 2, and apply less pressure. At that point, our goal is to remove any burrs rather than continuing to remove more material. But as long as there's no burr, and as long as our edge reflects the light, we know it's still dull and we can keep sharpening. It will take a moment with this one as it's a new blade with no edge at all. If it's not going as fast for you, don't worry, it's not a race. The first knife might take a bit longer, but with the next ones, you'll be more at ease. If you have any doubts about whether the angle is right, just check it often with the jig triangle. Don't worry about the subtitles, it's nothing important there. I can already see that the light reflection is fading in some parts, so we're getting close to some sharpness. Indicators that we're heading in the right direction include, first and foremost, the edge stops reflecting light. We stop seeing the shine. The second indicator is the burr. You might not always feel it, but you can run your finger across the blade's edge to see if anything sticks out. And a really neat third way is cutting paper. It's not about spectacularly slicing the paper in midair, but rather about pulling the cutting edge close to the fingers to see if it starts cutting into the paper at any point. Here I can see that it's cutting at the tip, but the rest is just sliding, which means I still have some work to do. By the time I finish, the edge should fly smoothly through the entire page. There's some discussion about whether you should make passes with the edge facing the direction of the movement or the other way round. While it might matter with waterstones, and if your sharpening technique isn't fully mastered yet, where there's a chance you'll catch the edge of the stone, it's definitely safer to move the knife with the edge at the back, as if you're caressing the sharpener. However, if you're using diamond stones, you can go back and forth with the same level of pressure. Not much can go wrong there, and our work will be twice as efficient. While sharpening, it's also a good idea to have a piece of cloth or paper towel ready to collect the dust that will accumulate on the blade. Just make sure that your finger never gets on the edge side. Always keep your fingers to the sides to avoid any risk of cutting yourself. Now I'm looking for those reflections. I can feel a slight burr here under my finger, but over here it's gone. Let's see what's happening with the paper now. It's much better now, but the heel side of the blade is still not quite there. Now I'm moving on to the part where I switch sides more frequently and press down more lightly. I don't want to remove too much material anymore because I don't want to create a new burr. I want to get rid of the existing one. So what we're actually doing is bending this burr back and forth until it eventually breaks off. With steels that aren't carbide based, which are more malleable, several centimeters of it can come off in the form of a little steel hair. That's probably where the Polish name for that comes from. It's called a wire. Near the end of sharpening now, I only go with the edge first setup so as to break off the burr and not aid its formation. And I'm changing sides more often now, pressing down more lightly each time. Soon I'll only be sweeping once per side. And now it's cutting pretty nicely through the paper. If you read up on sharpening, you'll soon find out that you supposedly need 20 different grits of stones, and without them, you're certain to fail at sharpening properly. However, if the edge cuts through the paper like this, it means I can comfortably slice a carrot, a tomato in midair, or whatever other kitchen acrobatics you need, and it's all been done with the most basic, lowest grit diamond plate. And the same goes for whetstones. If you properly sharpen the knife with the lower grits, then everything else is mainly for show. When we sharpen knives for customers, we flip the stone over to finish the edge on a higher grit side. In theory, it removes the leftover burr and prevents edge from microchipping. You can go through finer grits, or you can leave it be, and it should be functional and good enough for most applications anyway. When we sharpen knives for ourselves, we just end at 600 grit and head to the kitchen. Whether you go for finer grit or not, don't leave any imperfections on the coarse grits. Higher grits aren't for fixing any flaws, but rather to polish the edge and remove any remaining burr. At this point, it's not really about removing material anymore. It goes through paper nicely, so it seems we're getting there. With the next step, the blade will perform better with what's called a push cut. The way I drag the knife through the paper here is known as a pull cut. In that case, it's cutting with more of the blade's edge. However, if you enjoy chopping, like with an up and down motion, then it's definitely worth moving on to higher grits. You can also use leather. It's leather that's been treated with a polishing paste, and you can give your knife a few passes over it. This polishes the edge, picks up the remaining burr, and now we'll have a better push cut so it'll glide nicely through the paper. Let's do another test on a slightly larger piece to see if everything behaves well. The sound is good, nothing's torn, so the edge is ready. You can go ahead and cut. It's often the case that the tip gets damaged in knives. The tip has to be thin because of its tasks. If something is thin and metallic, it's also delicate. Fortunately, a broken tip is no big deal. To fix a broken tip, you need to grind down material from the spine side until it meets the cutting edge. We don't remove material from the edge side. to avoid changing its thickness, but grinding from the spine side doesn't cost us anything. So you can either send us the knife and we'll do it on a grinder, or you can flip your knife over on your own stone and just grind that tip down yourself. It may take some time, but it will work. Sharpening isn't as difficult as it may seem. If you manage to replicate even half of what you've seen here, you're already doing well. People often ask, how often should our knives be sharpened? There's sometimes an expectation that perhaps quality knives don't need sharpening at all, but the reality is that regardless of the steel they're made of, sharpening is simply part of owning a knife. Knives can become dull quickly, or they might dull a bit more slowly, but either way they'll need to be sharpened eventually. The actual answer to the question of how often you should sharpen your knives actually depends pretty little on the steel grade they're made of. Of course, if you take really good care of your knife, say you're a professional or you really try to maintain your knife, then it starts to make a bigger difference. The case is that most often a knife is dulled not because the steel wears down through work and friction against the cutting board. That's what the steel has a big influence on. Instead, most commonly, a knife gets dulled when it's banged against something hard like a frying pan or a stone countertop, or cutting through a steak on a plate. The thin cutting edge we've honed doesn't stand a chance against stone, ceramics, or steel. It'll just chip away. Or if the knife is made from a slightly softer steel, the edge will start to roll over or bend. So really, the answer to how often you need to sharpen your knife depends largely on you. Take good care of your knives. Make sure their edge doesn't come into contact with any metals, and ideally with any other hard objects. Don't just throw your knives into a drawer with forks clattering around. Your knife should have a separate spot where it can hang on a magnetic strip, be laid on a countertop, or be placed in a knife block. Choose what's most convenient for you. But no matter what steel your knife is made of, if you don't take care of it, it will dull quickly and you'll need to sharpen it frequently. Of course, when buying a knife, it's worth considering the steel it's made of because, let's be honest, that's a great joy to get a cool one. But ultimately, how long your knife stays sharp is up to you.